In the mid-14th century, one name struck more terror into the hearts of the French than any other: Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince. He was the quintessential knight of the Middle Ages, a paragon of chivalry on the battlefield, and a ruthless predator of the treasury. After the stunning victories at Crécy and Poitiers, where he captured the French King John II himself, the English dream of a continental empire seemed not just possible, but inevitable. By 1362, Edward was granted the Principality of Aquitaine, a vast, wealthy territory in southwestern France. He ruled from Bordeaux not as a mere governor, but as a sovereign prince, holding a court that rivaled the magnificence of London and Paris. But the history books often skip a crucial detail. Grandeur in the Middle Ages was not paid for with speeches, it was paid for with cold, hard bullion. And Edward, for all his military brilliance, was a man of staggering extravagance. He was a prince who lived on credit, a warrior who saw the world as a series of expensive conquests. This is the story of how the greatest soldier of his age was defeated not by a French sword, but by a mountain of unpaid debts. It is the story of a financial venture in the mountains of Spain that turned a golden age into a fiscal nightmare, ultimately ending the English dream in France forever. To understand the collapse, we must first understand the cost of the prince's lifestyle. When Edward moved his court to Bordeaux, he brought with him a level of English aristocratic excess that the local Gascon lords had never seen. He maintained a massive household of knights, administrators, and servants, all requiring wages, livery, and food. In the medieval world, status was synonymous with spending. To be a prince was to be a patron of the arts, a host of legendary tournaments, and a dispenser of lavish gifts. Edward was obsessed with his image. He was the superstar of the Plantagenet dynasty, and he spent money as if the ransoms from Poitiers would never run out. But Aquitaine was not a bottomless well of gold. The local economy relied on the wine trade in wool, but the taxes collected were barely enough to cover the daily administration of the realm. Edward was already walking a financial tightrope. He was a sovereign who had mastered the art of war, but he had never learned the discipline of the ledger. In 1366, a spark was ignited south of the Pyrenees that would eventually burn down the English dream. The Kingdom of Castile was in the throes of a brutal civil war. King Peter of Castile, a man so ruthless he was nicknamed Peter the Cruel, had been ousted from his throne by his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara. Henry was backed by the French. This was a geopolitical disaster for England. If a pro-French king sat on the throne of Castile, the French would have access to the powerful Castilian navy, a fleet that could cut off the sea lanes between London and Bordeaux. Peter the Cruel fled to the Black Prince's court in Bordeaux, begging for military intervention. He made Edward a promise that seemed too good to be true. Peter swore that if the prince helped him regain his throne, he would pay for the entire cost of the war. He promised gold, jewels, and territory. He even offered to hand over his daughters as hostages to guarantee the debt. To the Black Prince, this was the perfect opportunity. He could strike a blow against French influence, win more glory, and fill his emptying coffers all at once. It was a classic sovereign debt play. Edward committed the cardinal sin of finance. He took the word of a desperate man without an audit. In September 1366, they signed the Treaty of LIBOURNE. This was the legal instrument of Edward's doom. In this contract, the Black Prince agreed to lead an army of nearly 10,000 men across the mountains into Spain. The cost was astronomical. Edward had to hire the great companies, mercenary armies of seasoned killers who didn't fight for loyalty, only for wages. To fund the initial mobilization, Edward had to do the unthinkable. He began melting down his own silver plate and pawning his jewels to the bankers of Bordeaux. He was all in. He believed that a swift victory would lead to a massive payout from the Castilian treasury. He was betting his entire principality on the success of a single campaign. In April 1367, at the Battle of Nájera, the Black Prince proved once again why he was the most feared commander in Europe. Despite being outnumbered, his tactical genius and the terrifying efficiency of the English longbow crushed the forces of Henry of Trastamara. Military history calls Nájera a masterpiece. It was a total victory. Peter the Cruel was restored to his throne. The French were humiliated. On paper, the Black Prince had achieved everything he wanted. But as the dust settled on the Spanish plains, a new, more dangerous enemy appeared, the Bill. Edward waited. He waited for months in the blistering heat of the Spanish summer. His army was dying, not from arrows, but from dysentery and heat stroke. He sent envoy after envoy to Peter's court, demanding the promised payment. Peter the Cruel's response was a masterclass in political ghosting. He claimed the treasury was empty. He claimed he needed more time to collect taxes. He claimed the prince's costs were inflated. The realization began to sink in. The King of Castile had no intention of paying. Edward had spent his fortune, his health, and the lives of his men to put a liar back on a throne. The prince was now a victim of sovereign default. He had incurred a debt of nearly 2.7 million florins, a sum that Aquitaine could not hope to repay in a century. When the Black Prince finally limped back into Bordeaux in late 1367, he was a broken man. He had contracted a chronic illness, likely dropsy or dysentery, that would eventually kill him. But more importantly, he was followed by thousands of angry, unpaid mercenaries. The great companies didn't care about Peter the Cruel's lies. They had a contract with Edward. If they weren't paid, they would do what mercenaries always did. They would live off the land, looting and burning the very principality Edward was supposed to protect. Edward was desperate. He needed money, and he needed it now. He looked at the only group left to pay the price, his subjects in Aquitaine. He decided to impose a new universal tax, the feuillage, or the hearth tax. It was a tax on every household, rich or poor, and in that moment, the English dream began to turn into a French revolt. In the medieval world, power was a delicate balance between the sword and the law. For 20 years, the English had ruled through the sword, but by 1368, the Black Prince's sword was rusted by sickness, and his treasury was hollowed out by debt. To save his principality from bankruptcy, Edward made a choice that would haunt the house of Plantagenet for a century. He imposed the feuillage. He thought he was merely collecting revenue. In reality, he was handing his enemies the legal weapon they needed to destroy him. He wasn't just taxing chimneys, he was taxing the loyalty of his subjects. The Gascon lords had always been difficult. They were independent, fierce, and historically played the kings of England and France against each other. Under the Black Prince, they had initially been content, but the feuillage was a step too far. It was seen as an infringement on their ancient rights. Leading the charge was John I, Count of Armagnac. Armagnac was deep in debt himself, and the idea of sending his gold to pay for Edward's failed Spanish venture was an insult he could not endure. Armagnac didn't just refuse to pay, he looked north toward Paris. Under the Treaty of Bretigny, the King of England was supposed to be the absolute sovereign of Aquitaine, but there was a loophole. The final renunciations of sovereignty had never been formally exchanged. The bridge of authority was still standing, and Armagnac decided to cross it. While the Black Prince was the ultimate knight, his rival, King Charles V of France, was something new, a bureaucrat. Charles understood something the English had forgotten. Wars are won in the counting house, in the courtroom, as much as on the field. Charles V had been waiting for this moment. When the Count of Armagnac arrived in Paris to appeal against the Black Prince's tax, Charles saw his opening. If he accepted their appeal, he was effectively declaring himself the supreme lord of Aquitaine. He didn't reach for his sword, he reached for his lawyers. In early 1369, a French messenger arrived at the court in Bordeaux. He delivered a stunning ultimatum. King Charles V summoned the Black Prince to appear before the Parliament of Paris to answer the complaints of his vassals. The prince's reaction was legendary. Even in his sickness, the fire returned to his eyes. He snarled, "We will willingly go to Paris, but it will be with a helmet on our head and 60,000 men at our back." It was a magnificent boast, but it was a lie. Edward didn't have the money to pay for 6,000 men, let alone 60,000. By refusing the summons, Edward gave Charles V the legal pretext he needed. The French king declared that the English had forfeited their right to Aquitaine through their contumacy. With the stroke of a pen, the French dream of the Plantagenets was declared legally dead. The war was back on. This was not the war the English were used to. Charles V's commander, Bertrand du Guesclin, practiced what we would today call guerrilla warfare. He avoided the Black Prince's heavy cavalry. He bribed town officials. He used the local resentment over the fouage tax to flip the loyalty of entire cities. The English were paralyzed. Because of the prince's debt, they couldn't afford to garrison every town. They couldn't afford to pay their scouts. One by one, the jewels of Aquitaine, Limoges, Poitiers, and Abbeville began to slide back into French hands. The Black Prince was reduced to watching his empire evaporate from a litter. Desperation breeds cruelty. In 1370, the city of Limoges, which had been a favored English possession, defected to the French. This betrayal snapped the prince's sanity. Edward, too sick to walk, was carried to the walls of Limoges in a carriage. What followed was a stain on the history of chivalry. Edward ordered his men to show no mercy. Historical accounts describe thousands being put to the sword while the sick prince watched from his litter. It was a military victory, but a moral and political catastrophe. The massacre at Limoges proved that the English were no longer the rightful lords, but foreign occupiers who had lost their way. By 1371, Edward's health had collapsed completely. He could no longer lead, no longer govern, and certainly no longer pay his debts. He was forced to resign his principality and return to England. He left behind a land that was broken, bankrupt, and slipping away. Edward the Black Prince, the man who had won the greatest battles of his age, was returning home as a failure. He had been utterly defeated by the cold, relentless mathematics of debt. The shadow of Spain had finally eclipsed the sun of Aquitaine. When Edward the Black Prince set foot on English soil in 1371, he was no longer the golden icon of the 100 Years' War. He was a shadow, a man consumed by disease and haunted by a failure measured in lost credit. The hero of Poitiers had returned to a country on the brink of exhaustion. The Black Death had hollowed out the population, and the endless war had hollowed out the treasury. For years, the English people had cheered for Edward's victories, assuming that the spoils of war would pay for the cost of glory. But as the prince lay dying in Westminster, the truth emerged. The Spanish campaign hadn't just broken Edward's health, it had poisoned the entire financial system of the English crown. As the Black Prince withered away, a power vacuum opened. King Edward III was sinking into senility, leaving the kingdom in the hands of his younger son, John of Gaunt, and a circle of corrupt advisors. They resorted to increasingly predatory ways to raise funds, mismanaging the wool trade and taking bribes for royal favors. The English people were beginning to feel like they were being milked dry to pay for a war that was already lost.
The debt incurred in Spain was like a ghost that had followed Edward home, and it was now haunting every household in England.
In April 1376, the tension finally snapped. This was the birth of the Good Parliament, one of the most significant moments in the history of English finance. For the first time, the representatives of the towns refused to grant the king a new tax until they were given an audit of the royal accounts. They were tired of funding sovereign adventures like the Spanish campaign that yielded nothing but debt. Led by Peter de la Mare, the first Speaker, the Parliament launched a frontal assault on royal corruption. They impeached the king's ministers. This was the first time in history that the people used the power of the purse to hold the crown accountable. They weren't just fighting for money, they were fighting for the principle that the king's debts were not the people's debts. And in the background, the Black Prince gave them his silent blessing. He knew the system built on credit was finally collapsing. On June 8, 1376, Edward the Black Prince died at the age of 45. He was buried in Canterbury Cathedral in a tomb of magnificent bronze, a monument to a chivalric ideal that was already dying. He left behind a 10-year-old son, Richard, and a legacy that was as heavy as it was glorious. His passing marked the true end of the first phase of the 100 Years' War. The man who had dreamed of a continental empire had left behind a kingdom that was too broke to even defend its own shores. A year later, King Edward III died, and the crown passed to the boy king, Richard II. The wars in France continued to bleed the treasury dry, but the tactics of glory were no longer working. To pay for the defense of the remaining English lands, the government made a fatal mistake. In 1381, they imposed a poll tax, a flat tax on every head in the kingdom. This was the final echo of the Black Prince's debt. This tax sparked the Peasants' Revolt, the greatest popular uprising in English history. Thousands marched on London, executing the king's treasurer. They were screaming the same thing the Gascon lords had shouted 10 years prior: "We will not pay for your failed dreams." By the time Richard II was deposed in 1399, the English dream was effectively over. The vast Principality of Aquitaine had shrunk to a few coastal outposts. The English had learned a hard lesson in the price of power. You can win every battle, you can capture every king, but if you cannot manage your balance sheet, you cannot hold an empire. The Black Prince had been a master of the sword, but he was a slave to the loan. His debt hadn't just ended his own reign, it had broken the back of the Plantagenet dynasty. We look back at the Middle Ages and see knights and castles, but behind every suit of armor was a financier, and behind every conquest was a creditor. The story of Edward the Black Prince is a warning that echoes through the centuries. It tells us that the greatest threat to an empire is rarely the enemy at the gates. It is the interest rate on the debt used to build those gates. Glory is fleeting, but a default lasts forever. In the end, the English dream in France didn't die on a battlefield. It died in the counting houses of Bordeaux and the angry halls of Westminster. I'm Gavin, and this is Medieval Echoes. Subscribe to break the cycle, because history doesn't just repeat, it rhymes. If you know the pattern, you own the future.